and welcome to another episode of Associations Unplugged, Kellen, Europe's podcast on how to future-proof your associations. My name is Anna Gumbau and I am your podcast host. So today's episode is going to be around the trends and everything that we need to look ahead for 2026. 2026 is shaping up to be a major reset and milestone moment for Brussels, from shifting priorities and geopolitical pressures, as well as a battle over the EU budget that will shape everything from the Green Deal to industrial policy and defense spending. These aren't just political developments, they're going to define how all sectors operate, where the money flows, and what priorities will rise and fade. From Kellen Europe's perspective, that's why this conversation matters. Associations cannot afford to simply react once proposals land on the table. The real influence comes now in anticipating what the future priorities and future plans are going to be, where the agenda is heading, aligning with broader missions like competitiveness and resilience, and positioning ourselves before negotiations truly begin. And so for associations, knowing what's going to happen in 2026 matters because the next cycle will change the context in which we advocate and we support our members. From budget decisions to geopolitical pressures and shifting priorities will be affecting funding, regulations, and where the EU chooses to focus its energy. So, to help us make sense of what's coming, we're joined by Sophie Pornschlegel. She is a senior advisor at the European Policy Center and an expert on EU governance and the long-term political trends that we must be looking into. So we will be looking at the future of the European Union's policies, the geopolitics that will shape the EU priorities, as well as the national developments we have to be taking attention to, and what associations can start doing now to stay ahead. So let's dive in. Sophie, very warm welcome. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
So let's dive in straight to the conversation. If you would select 3 topics that are going to be the highest priority in the agenda of EU policymakers for next year, which ones would you choose and why?
So I think it's not going to be a surprise, the ones I will choose, because there is some continuity compared to this year. I think the first big priorities will continue to be defense and security. Obviously, the war in Ukraine is continuing. We have an issue with our transatlantic relations, so it's a bit of a question of defense spending will be managed to kind of be defense-proof in a way. The second one is competitiveness because our economies are not doing great. So this will continue to be a huge question. And the third one is, especially at EU level, the simplification packages. So what's it called? Omnibus. Which some people say it's simplifications, others say it's more deregulation, some say will boost competitiveness, others say it's actually not really helpful. There's a lot of different perspectives on it, but it's really something that will go through the entire mandate until 29. So it's something that next year, for instance, there's the energy simplification package coming out.
So then let's dive into the first one of the priorities, everything around EU security and defense. If EU security spending rises, how do you think the associations and professionals in Brussels should be repositioning their narrative? Should we really start aligning with a more of a security first era? How do you think it's going to affect different industries in practice?
Maybe one thing I also forgot to mention is obviously the multi-annual financial framework, so the EU budget, which is going to be a huge issue, but I'm sure we're going to talk about it. But I think it's also the negotiations are already starting, and that's going to be a huge issue as well, because in the end, it will decide upon which kind of priorities will be important and which ones won't. On the question about security versus climate, I think there is a certain degree to which trade associations should adapt to the new narratives and make sure that they showcase also that, climate is a security issue, I would say. At the same time, I would also say that trade associations do have some leverage and some power and influence to also shape the narrative. So, decision makers don't live in a vacuum. So it's important to also showcase that it continues to be important to have legal certainty, for instance, to not, slash any kind of regulations you had before. To kind of have some continuity within what the EU is doing is quite important. So I think that's something, trade associations can do. But I would say that in the general context, security is quite important, but everything can be framed as a security topic, whether it's climate, or digital sovereignty, for instance.
Absolutely. And because you mentioned also the transatlantic alliance and the transatlantic relations. And I guess this is a topic that touches very closely across industries and across sectors, right? How do you assess the current state of transatlantic relations, and what are the milestones, the points of contention that we should be looking into?
Huge and very difficult topic. So I think we have to accept reality as it is, that we have a US president who is not interested in Europe, and understand that, and also understand that they are, defending US interests and not European interests. So any kind of historical transatlantic relations that we had are pretty much done. I think we really need to make sure that we keep our sovereignty. And I know it's a very French perspective, but I'm not French. I'm sorry about that. In the sense that we need to manage our interdependencies way better when it comes to critical raw materials, when it comes to the tech sector. Because if we are too dependent on others, whether it's the US or China, then we will have an issue. And I think we need to be way quicker and making sure to kind of define which are the core sectors that really need, more European sovereignty in a way. And I know that Macron and Merz are pretty much going into that direction, but it's also very slow because we need to build those ecosystems, especially when it comes to the tech industry, for instance. The second thing is on transatlantic relations is that I would also be careful and kind of like, at the same time accepting the reality as it is and trying to keep good relations as much as we can with the White House, but also make sure that we don't completely forget our values because, there is a authoritarian president in the US right now who's destroying democracy. And I think in Europe, we tend to kind of forget how bad it looks in the US. So to kind of really understand also what's really happening in the US and to see how we can, adapt our responses to it is quite important because we also don't want to lose our legitimacy and to say that democracy is not important anymore.
Mm-hmm. You've mentioned the keyword sovereignty.
Yes.
Do you think like all these priorities that we're seeing for the year ahead at the end of the day can be summarized in that keyword, on sovereignty?
So I'm currently doing research on it. And I think it's a bit of a buzzword, our call to action to say that we need to kind of find more European responses. So I would be also careful in calling everything sovereignty, but what needs to be clear is that in a moment of crisis, and we are in one for several years now, countries, just like people, I would say, have a tendency to be much more inward-looking, much more nationalistic, to kind of be less open-minded and to kind of, be like protectionist. And I wouldn't say that's necessarily the right choice to make. I think we also need to stop being so defeatist in a way, or to say, oh, it's the end of the West and we are just on that kind of downhill. That's not going to help us for the future. I think we need to be very strategic about, what kind of sectors do we need to invest in. That's going to be really relevant for the EU budget as well. We need to be much more working together and coordinating, because I know that member states, 27 is a lot, but they need to be really clear about, what is our long-term interest in working together. And what I see, unfortunately, is that there's a lot of very short-term thinking and a lot of, particular interests in trying to kind of protect certain industries that are not really viable in the long term, not sustainable. So I think investing in making sure that those industries transition properly would be much more, efficient.
Because in the past year, there's been a big push in terms of building a real industrial policy at EU level. And I'm just curious to hear from you, to which extent do you think this will be just, it will be stay in the kind of commitments on paper, or we're really going to see a major shift and really Europe having a stable, solid industrial policy at the bloc level, which is something that I think just a few years back seemed quite unthinkable, to be fair.
Yeah, I mean, I have to say that I was quite surprised to see that there's really a push to have a European industrial policy, and I think it's necessary. It started with a Net Zero Industry Act. Also, coming from the Green Deal, realizing that you really need to bring also industry along and having an economic policy that goes towards, net zero. Was a good first step. And then we had the Clean Industrial Deal, which was presented earlier this year, which also goes in the right direction. So I think the Commission has a good understanding of in which direction it should go. The question is, of course, always, the devil is in the detail, and then implementation really fails. And I think there's a lot of things where it can fail, unfortunately. The first one is finance, mobilizing and leveraging the finance that will be necessary. So for that, we need a capital and savings union, which is a big topic, but really difficult just to make sure that we have enough money for these investments. We need to kind of make sure that we change our state aid and subsidies and make sure that it's not like kind of a subsidies race where bigger countries win and smaller countries don't. And the third one is also make sure that we don't forget the just transition or the social aspects of an industrial policy. So I think there's a lot of, different pillars on like how to make sure that the EU industrial policy will work out.
In the past few years, it seems that we've been jumping from one crisis to the other. It seems that, just a few years ago, Brexit seemed to be the biggest of our issues. And then I think it pales in comparison with all the struggles and geopolitical complications and crises we've been facing. Do you think that now it could potentially become the moment where EU member states are serious about joint borrowing, about advancing the capital investments union? What would you say?
I think it completely depends on whether our leaders, mostly like the heads of states and government, realize that it is such a crucial and urgent moment, and to make sure that, our institutions are agile enough to be able to shift. And I think there is maybe more of a fundamental issue where the EU seems to kind of go back to what it used to do, which is deregulation and liberalization, and then it tried to shift in the last mandate towards more digital transformation and the Green Deal to kind of build up stuff, which was a little bit out of the scope of what the EU was used to. And I feel like they're kind of going back to what, they used to do. And I really hope that the EU kind of also thinks about what kind of instruments are necessary, because right now it's mostly regulating or deregulating and like funding. But I'm wondering whether we need to kind of like, one, be more ambitious, and I kind of also kind of shift framing sometimes and be like, what do we actually need to get where we want to be? So to have more, to get out of this kind of like crisis mode and like current, like always short-term thinking towards more like, where do we actually want to be in 10 years and how do we manage to get there? And I think this kind of foresight thinking, unfortunately, is getting a little bit lost because of all these crises that we're facing.
Because within these three priorities, then the capital investments union, the just transition, as well as the state aid, which of these elements do you think are going to be most relevant for Brussels professionals, for association professionals? Is there a way that they could potentially be influencing these debates?
I think it very much depends on the industry sector you're in. I know trade associations have, their lobbyists. I think what I would, my biggest message would really to be think long term, of course, there is a certain, the Euro bubble, and you do have the next legislative file that you are going to try to kind of do advocacy on or lobby on. But I think it's also important to kind of see it in an ecosystem way, or to say, look, certain industry areas will affect others, certain policy fields affect others, and to kind of think about what's in the kind of general interest as well, so that certain industry sectors are also more viable in the long term. I know I said that before, but I think it's really relevant to kind of get maybe out of the kind of tunnel view and just be like, oh, these are the kind of three flies that are going to be important, and see more what in industrial policy is relevant to us, but also what kind of ecosystem do we need so that, our industries are going to do well in the next 10 to 15 years.
Absolutely. And this is also one of the key questions that we're really trying to address here. Let's say, how do we future-proof our priorities, and then from there, how do we get to influence them? Right?
Just maybe one point, because the Commission started all these strategic dialogues. One of the most important one was obviously for the automotive industry, and I think it's quite interesting to see that they are trying to bring together stakeholders to discuss the future of certain industries, and I think it's a good thing. I just hope that there is some kind of, steering and doesn't get lost in translation again, because that's always the issue that happens with the EU, that, it comes with good intentions, and then you have these long stakeholder roundtables, and then in the end, it's a bit well, not much came out of it.
Exactly. Yeah, you keep wondering to which extent those are tangible developments, but there seems to be a commitment right now to be engaging more on industry, across industries. For instance, I happened to be at one of the defense implementation dialogues, and there was really, I think, a real commitment from commissioners to listen to what industries are saying. So I'm guessing this is an important point that associations across industry should be leveraging, right?
Yeah, definitely. And also maybe a second point is also not just, I know we're sitting in Brussels, but, not just to look at the EU level, because obviously competences can be limited in certain fields, but to also really make sure that there is more coordination between people working in trade associations, between the EU level and the national level, because the national level plays a huge role, and obviously the bigger countries, but right now, I would say even more. I mean, the European Council will decide in which direction it goes. So it's something, it's a level not to forget.
We'll get into international politics soon. Before that, because one of the priorities that you've mentioned is indeed the negotiations ahead of the multi-annual financial framework. So the EU's budget between 2028 and 2034. The negotiations seemed, and the discussions around it at least seem to be very heated.
Yes.
If you would take the temperature, how would it be? How would they be looking like?
Well, it doesn't look good. I think it's going to be, MFF. So MFF is the EU budget. Sorry, it's like the terrible abbreviations in Brussels. They've always been really difficult because in the end, you have a principle of juste retour, as you say, where net contributor countries want their money back, maybe in a bit of a Thatcherite way. But it's very hard to kind of move the needle, and there's very strong forces to keep the status quo. Except that the EU budget is not future-proof at all. Like, it's still a third for agricultural subsidies, a lot for cohesion policy. I'm not saying these domains are not important, but if you want to invest in defense and competitiveness, and also make sure, for instance, that our democracies remain stable, you need to invest in them. And if it's not in the EU budget, then you need to find some other money somewhere else. Also knowing that we have an economic recession or, are on the verge of it, which means that public spending in member states is already really tight. So they don't want to spend more money on the EU. So it's going to be even more difficult, I would say, than in previous years. And they will have time until the end of 2027 to negotiate it. I think the Commission proposal that came out like mid-July this year is quite ambitious. Like they tried to kind of change quite a bit. They changed by presenting the competitiveness fund, which is like directly managed money, and the indirectly managed money through the national and regional partnership plans where they put in agriculture and cohesion. So I think that's kind of a shift, and they tried to streamline it by also reducing the amount of programs to make it easier because, otherwise you won't understand anything anymore. So there's been a push to be more ambitious and to kind of make it better and more agile and more flexible, also to respond to crisis better. But the response from the member states has been really critical. We'll have to see how it looks like. The Danish Council presidency is going to present its negotiation toolbox in December before the next European Council. So that's the kind of next milestone to look at and see what's in there.
If we would be looking into the existing, let's say, budget lines and different sectors, which ones do you think would be happier with the proposal as it currently stands, and which one would be the harshest critics?
It kind of depends very much on your perspective. Maybe one thing I forgot to mention, which is quite important as well, is that we had like an extra budget line in a way from 2020 to 2026 with Next Generation EU, which was like the COVID fund. And this needs also to be paid back in the next MFF. So that means that there is like 150 billion euros that's already taken out of the MFF just to repay the loans. So while the Commission tried to frame it as if, this budget is going to be even bigger than before, in the end, it's not that much bigger than what we have now. So I think we're already kind of working with a very tight budget in the first place. I would say that those that will be happy are hopefully those that work on defense and competitiveness. I think the competitiveness fund is quite like a positive thing. And theoretically, those that work on agriculture and cohesion would not be super happy because it tried to be reduced a little bit. But yeah, it depends on the perspectives of the people, I would say.
Right. Because I was about to ask you, how did you see the establishment of the competitiveness fund? Whether do you think that it's going to be steps in the right direction to future-proof our industries and our economy?
Well, I think it's smart, to say, look, we have to establish such a fund and we need to kind of, we have a clean industrial deal. We need to kind of reach net zero. We need to transition all these industries and decarbonize them. We need money for that. And I think that's smart to kind of establish a competitiveness fund, which also has a big part looking at innovation and to make sure that we don't have like a huge brain drain towards the US, for instance. So I think it goes into the right direction. But as always, the question is how much will it be? Because if you remember the Draghi report, which is another, big important topic in the Brussels field, he said that we're lacking like 800 billion euros in investment. And if you look at what it's going to be in the MFF, it's not going to be that much. So I think it's always a question of like, how much money is actually going to be there, and is this money going to be effective in what it tries to achieve?
Because let me then pick up on that, because I've seen also in recent weeks that we had plenty of events across town, reflecting on the 1 year after the Draghi report. I'm curious to hear your assessment on that. 1 year on, have we gotten to do much?
I mean, I think Draghi also published something where he said he wasn't very happy with how it's going. maybe two more points, because there's also two other reports we tend to forget, which is the Minister report and the Letter report. And in the Letter report in particular, he said that we need to deepen the single market. And if I looked at the work program of the Commission for next year, I only saw one thing for the single market. So the problem is that we do have a super fragmented single market. And I'm not sure that just, putting everything on deregulation through omnibus to boost competitiveness is going to help. I think we really need to make sure that we have less of a fragmented single market, that we make sure that we coordinate better, because that's a good way to make sure that we're more efficient and that we don't spend money on 27 different member states, not being coordinated. So I think there's we're kind of putting everything onto this omnibus packages without kind of looking at what other ways are they to kind of boost competitiveness. And I think, maybe also want to say, even if Draghi did a report that's very helpful, I would also say, he's not an elected official, and it's important to mention that. So it's basically just an expert. Like, the Commission doesn't have to kind of, implement everything that he says in the report. It was basically just a report.
No, of course. And coming back to the question also around the single market, there's not really one without the other. There's no competitiveness without the single market. And every industry that I talk to, they will always say that the one item on the wish list is really the harmonization across sectors. So it seems that have we forgotten about the deepening of the single market?
Yes, personally, I'm quite. I think it's quite sad that we forgot about it, because it's really one of the biggest achievements that we have in the EU, and that makes our strength as well. Of course, we also have trade policy, but that's a bit in a difficult situation in limbo. But I think there is, very simple steps that we could take to make sure that our single market is deepened. And I think especially on finance and capital markets, that would be a good first step. And I understand that there are particular interests saying, oh, we don't want that because we might lose out. But we need to look at the bigger picture here. And, there's no one member state that will save the EU from being in an economic slump. It needs to be a common effort.
Now let's then move to national politics, because we've already briefly touched upon that. Where should we be looking at? What about national politics in EU member states? What are some potential shifts, potential points of tension that we might have to keep an eye on?
So I actually looked, and there's 6 parliamentary elections and 2 presidential elections to watch out for next year, which is quite a bit, especially as this will change the composition of the European Council. There's a lot to look at. I would also say that we saw that there is a shift to the far right in general. We had of course, we have Orban in Hungary, we have Fico in Slovakia, we have Babiš in Czechia. So I think this shift will continue. I think a big issue is also the lacking stability of many governments. We had elections in the Netherlands. In France, we had, I don't know how many prime ministers this year. The next French presidential election is in 2027 next year. So this should be hopefully a little bit stable. But I think we still have the issue of lacking stability in the member states. And that really affects EU policymaking. So that's a huge issue. And to make sure that we have member states that are stable and that have a position, that would be a first step.
Absolutely. Especially when we're talking about the big member states that are supposed to continue with this pro-European perspective, right?
And then, definitely. And then the second thing is also, but that's something that I guess everyone knows, that we have this huge issue with Orban, who constantly puts his veto, especially when it comes to Ukraine. And I think that really showcases I wouldn't say it's a polarization, but that certain member states that have a very authoritarian tendency, because right now, according to tons of NGOs, Hungary is not even a democracy anymore. And I think that really undermines EU policymaking. So, to also think about how can we make sure that we don't have that shift to the far right, because that really affects EU decision making. And then we might have tons of member states vetoing any kind of new initiative from the EU, which then puts into question what's the point in having a legislative machine at EU level if you just don't want to have the EU in the first place. So to kind of future-proof the EU as well, and make sure that we kind of keep that, because in the end, and that's something that's very basic but is often forgotten, is that if we do common legislation, it's because it benefits us all. And I know sometimes it's hard to see because there's legislations on bananas and I don't know what in the EU, but the original point is that we're stronger together, and to kind of, look in the long term and look at how can the EU make sure that we are future-proofing even us nationally, that we are stronger, and that, smaller countries are stronger, but also France and Germany them by themselves are nothing compared to China and the US. So they need the EU.
And out of curiosity, out of the different elections that you've listed, which ones would you think are the most relevant, or which are the ones that we should really be putting in our calendars?
So I have my list here, and we have Hungary, Slovenia, Cyprus, Sweden, Denmark, and Latvia for the parliamentary elections. I think Sweden should be interesting. I particularly, that's maybe a personal favorite, is to look at Hungary, because there is a strong contender against Orban this time. So it could be really interesting to see what happens there. And maybe Cyprus as well, because Cyprus and Ireland are going to have the presidency of the Council in 2026. So to also follow what happens in Cyprus. And also, it's not because they're small member states that one shouldn't be interested.
Sure. Especially with the big role that comes ahead with them. So then, Sophie, one final question then. What is the one, or what are the key recommendations that you would be giving to the association professionals listening to us to future-proof themselves for the year ahead?
Oh God, that's a bit of a difficult one. I have so many recommendations. I think something that I already mentioned is to maybe look beyond your own industry and look at the more general developments, and also try to get out of the crisis mode and really, think ahead in the sense of, thinking about what will make my industry sustainable in the long term more than just next year. And also to kind of get out maybe of just a particular interest to look at, what is in the general interest. Because as I said, we're in a moment where everyone seems to be very inward looking, and infighting is really strong. Mm-hmm. And I think that's not necessarily a very positive or constructive way forward. Mm-hmm. Sure. And that also means building maybe unlikely alliances, trying to see what other industry sectors are doing, what happens in other policy fields, to try to see if you can build networks and connections there. I know it sounds quite broad, but I think that's really some issues I've seen in the past years in EU policymaking that I found quite sad. Mm-hmm. And of course, then, the usual kind of monitoring, of course, legislation, the work program of the Commission is out. There's tons of there's a lot of stuff happening. And maybe also one last point is to have your own critical thinking and realize that you have leverage and power yourself. Mm-hmm. And therefore, you shouldn't just follow the trends and say, oh, let's boost competitiveness by doing another omnibus package, but really think about, is this evidence-based? Does that make sense? Because it's not because the Commission does it that it's necessarily smart and good. Mm-hmm. Maybe just one point on the omnibus packages, because there's been no impact assessments, no public consultations. There's really procedural problems of integrity with it. So to kind of also, think by yourself and say, is that in our interest long term? Is that also in the interest of the Commission, or are they losing legitimacy with that? To kind of, think maybe beyond also the kind of typical trends and discourses.
Would you think that 2026 is going to be a busier year than 2025 for us EU professionals?
I feel it gets busier every year. But then I think it depends, of course. What might be relevant is also to have your own priorities and kind of make sure that you have your objectives and kind of stick to that, and then to not make it completely overwhelmed, because I think it's very easy to get overwhelmed in the EU policy sphere because there's so much to kind of, follow. But it will definitely be a very interesting year. And I really hope personally that especially the EU budget negotiations will go well, because that's a really crucial next step.
Absolutely. And I hope that before the year ahead, before 2026, we get a couple of weeks and days to get to recharge.
Yes.
For the big battles ahead. Sophie, it's been an absolute pleasure to have you here at Associations Unplugged. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
And thank you very much to all of our listeners for following us and for being with us in another episode of Associations Unplugged. As you may have seen, we have a lot of issues, a lot of files and national elections and discussions ahead to be following in 2026. So today we got to disentangle some of these issues. And in the meantime, while we prepare for the year ahead for 2026, we wish you a very nice break if you get to have one before 2026, and see you at the next episode of Associations Unplugged.